The earth is out of balance. We see it everywhere. Floods engulf entire regions, leaving behind a trail of destruction. Wildfires rage across continents, turning skies an eerie orange. Storms, once rare, now batter coastlines with terrifying frequency. These aren't isolated incidents, they are the alarm bells of a planet in distress. Climate change, once a distant threat, has become our daily reality. The earth is speaking, and its message is one of urgency and consequence. For decades, scientists have warned about the consequences of our actions. The warming oceans are also fueling more intense storms. Hurricanes, cyclones, and typhoons are forming over warmer waters, gaining strength and becoming more destructive. Coastal erosion is accelerating, swallowing homes and businesses. The economic and human toll of these storms is staggering, leaving behind a trail of devastation that takes years to recover from. Behind these statistics are real people, real communities torn apart by the impacts of climate change. Farmers watch helplessly as their crops wither and die in prolonged droughts. Coastal residents are forced to abandon their homes, displaced by rising seas and powerful storms. Indigenous communities, often living in fragile ecosystems, are on the front lines of this crisis, their traditional ways of life threatened by the changing climate. The climate crisis is also a matter of social justice. Those who have contributed the least to the problem, the poorest and most vulnerable communities, are often the ones who suffer the most from its impacts. This is a global injustice that demands our attention and action. We have a moral imperative to address climate change and create a more just and equitable world for all.
Phyllis's next guest has a novel approach to solving the challenges of climate change. Following decades of leadership in Silicon Valley, Don Maruska became a master certified coach, focusing on helping leaders and teams in major corporations, nonprofits, and government agencies. He has provided professional development for over 10,000 leaders in local governments in 30 states each year. He is well known on the business media circuit, including publications Fast Company and Inc. magazine. Don Maruska is the author of Solve Climate Change Now. Do what you love for a healthy planet. You are watching Profunda TV with host Phyllis Haynes.
We are recording. Don, it's such a pleasure to see you. And since we have known each other through the world of coaching, I am delighted to have a chance to jump into this work of yours that is multidimensional and very powerful. Let me ask, what brought you to the issue of climate change? What moved you from helping people with business decisions? You have 3 books, major books. What brought you to this issue?
Well, for the past several decades, one of the areas that I've worked in is helping to resolve very complex and challenging issues involving environmentalists, fishermen, business people, government officials and agencies, etc. So I've been in the environmental sphere for a fair while, trying and succeeding in helping those organizations and stakeholders come together and solve really tough issues in mutually satisfactory ways. So I've learned a lot about how to engage people around these topics. But what really riveted me to climate change as an issue was when our family went to Iceland in 2019. And my daughter and I went on a glacier walk, and it involved also going into these beautiful ice caves. And the ice caves are formed when the glacier starts to melt. And when it starts to melt, rivers of water start to flow within the glacier. And they create these beautiful caves that look absolutely fantastic, but they also toll the death of the glacier. because once those rivers of water start flowing through, what happens is it acts like a saw and just undercuts the glacier. So the glacier we were in was losing 45 feet a year. In other places in Iceland, they were having funerals in the churches for the death of glaciers that had entirely disappeared. So as I was there in this beautiful ice cave with our daughter, I was just thinking to myself, what's her future going to be and the future of generations beyond hers? And I decided I couldn't just sit by and let this happen without doing the best that I could to have a positive impact. And I saw particular ways and particular approaches that were new and different for how to engage people around climate change, and therefore felt motivated to share that to get more people doing what's needed to boost awareness, action, and advocacy for a healthy climate.
Well, you certainly have done it in a very engaging way. I got your book, I read your book. I couldn't, I wasn't expecting, I was expecting, I know your business side very well, but this is a very playful and helpful book on helping people figure out what they love. Now, how does your idea of helping people figure out what they love solve climate change? How does it work?
Sure. Well, it's really in the nature of the problem that climate change poses for us. As humans, we're really evolved to deal with acute problems. Like the tiger comes at us and we either kill the tiger or run away. There's short-term, quick action, fast response kinds of things. And we're quite good at that. And you see that in our medical sphere. People love to go in and they get a procedure and they're fixed. But if you talk with them about the chronic problems that they have, you know, issues of their lungs and their breathing or their weight or other things that are chronic problems, they fail. And the reason they fail is they don't have the self-motivation to sustain their efforts. And when I looked at climate change, I realized, it took about 170 years for us to put 1.5 trillion tons of excess CO2 into the atmosphere. And it's, by the way, just sitting up there. It takes 300 to 1,000 years for that excess carbon dioxide to dissipate. So we're just adding and adding and adding it up there. So it's taken that long to create the problem that we face. And it's going to take a couple decades for us to work through it. We need to work very energetically and actively now, not wait for 2 decades to go by, but it's going to take some time. So that kind of chronic problem takes a different approach to solving. And that approach is one that really is founded on self-motivation. So it's the same thing with weight loss, with chronic problems that people may have. They have to be self-motivated because there's no quick fix for them. And the same thing for climate. We have to be self-motivated. And how do we become self-motivated? Well, the thing that's striking to me is how many people, after a long day at work or actively doing chores or whatever, at the end of the day, have something that they do that brings them renewed energy and vigor and interest. That's what they love to do. That's something that gives them energy. That's something that brings forth their best efforts. So the whole idea of the book is to help people figure out how they can marry what it is that they love to do with what needs to be done for a healthy climate. And then that's that climate sweet spot where those intersect. And that gives them a sustainable and self-motivating way to do what's needed for us to have a healthy climate future.
So you have some quotes in your book. You talk about instead of proselytizing, finding something that's joyful. Um, you refer to several powerful people about the power of joy and enthusiasm. So, can you give me an example of someone for example, I like to give parties. So, I would suspect that I could give parties around discussing what we could all do on climate change. Or I like interviewing people as I'm doing now.
Right.
But you have some people in your book that have figured out ways of creating joy.
Right. Well, there's one example is Calla Rose created an organization called Nerds for Earth. And so those are essentially people who love to create these software apps. You know, they're nerdy types and all, and they want to do something for the climate, but they don't know what. So they connect those nerds, with people that are seeking to identify and visualize and impact climate issues. And then they're doing what they love, and they're doing it for something that's going to make a difference. And so there's some illustrations in the book about how they created a whole visualization of what were soil policies around the United States. Soil is a very big potential way of sequestering carbon and holding it in the earth rather than having it be emitted back out into the atmosphere as carbon dioxide. So it's a part of the solution. So it was a good, and they had fun. They made a difference. They got legislation passed because they could help legislators visualize the problem. So that's one of the issues with climate change. You know, all of the gases that create greenhouse effects for us, carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, are all invisible. And humans are primarily a visual response species. So if we don't see it, it's not real. It's quite interesting to me that the Clean Air Act was passed in 1970. Why was it passed in 1970? Because people saw the smog, and the smog being particulate matter, different than greenhouse gases in their source. And they said, we don't want to breathe that yellow brown air. And legislation got passed. But here we are now 54 years later, and nothing's happened about the greenhouse gas pollution that's happening because we haven't really visualized it. So having these ways of visualizing the problem really can help us see the need and the urgency of impacting it. And there's some new things that are happening, like the Environmental Defense Fund has created these satellites to observe methane that's being released from old abandoned oil and gas wells. And they're going to be putting that information out on the web. And then people can see, oh, that's emitting methane. Methane is 80 times more potent than carbon dioxide, so super important to deal with it. And we can now mobilize the public to get involved in saying, hey, we want that problem solved because we see it.
So that's really helpful. Now, a part of seeing something is also seeing the results. That's also difficult with climate change. In other words, you could take a lot of action and you might not see the result immediately. What can we do about that?
Well, it's really what we're improving are some of the ways we can measure that. So, for example, if we look at one of the very significant sources of greenhouse gases is actually our commercial agricultural system, or at least the typical one, which involves a process of essentially, once the crop is gathered, then they till it, and they in essence turn over and release all of the CO2 that was in the ground back up into the atmosphere. And they kill all the beneficial microbes that are carbon-based that would be able to hold that carbon dioxide as living carbon in the soil. And that's because we've just happened to evolve how we do commercial agriculture to do it in that way. It started in the 1930s when they decided, okay, rather than counting on the soil to be healthy, they would use chemical fertilizers. And the chemical fertilizers would be used. Well, the plants don't really absorb the chemical fertilizers very well. So you know the story about how we get the methane from the cows burping, because they're being fed corn, which they didn't evolve to digest. They evolved to digest, grasses. And so when we put them in feedlots and feed them corn, they burp out lots of methane. Well, actually, the plants are doing that in their own way. When they get these chemical fertilizers, they burp out, if you will, this nitrous oxide, which is like 300 times more potent than carbon dioxide. So instead of agriculture, being a natural way to draw through photosynthesis the CO2 from the atmosphere and put it into the ground as living carbon in the soil and hold it there, our agriculture is working in a way that's releasing it into the air again and actually multiplying our problems. It's almost as impactful as the amount of carbon dioxide and other gases that are released from transportation, from driving cars and trucks around. So it's actually very substantial. So there are people who are working to measure the ability of the soils to hold their carbon, to get readings of that so we know how healthy the soil is or isn't, and to see the beneficial impacts of that so that we can hopefully change our agricultural policies, which currently subsidize monocrops and traditional and chemical fertilizers, all of which are creating and exacerbating the problem we have rather than solving it. So point by point, people are moving along and discovering how to measure and how to become aware of these impacts and how to see the impacts of their own efforts.
Well, you also help the individual think about what he or she can do in their own sphere, because you make a point in the book that it's lots of us individually that will make a difference, that we can't just rely on the scientists to solve the problem, that we have to bring it home. Uh, so, have you gotten any people who have responded to that notion? I mean, I do try to recycle, for example, but it's frustrating because we don't know what the recyclers are doing at the other end of that process. So,
Right.
what are your thoughts about this?
Well, it's a great question. And one of the things that's really key around this is what our theory of change is. What's our conception of how we're going to shift this dynamic? And I use a simple model, I call it the triple A for climate health. And it involves awareness, action, and advocacy. And so in order for us to change what's happening, we need more people involved in being part of one or more of those so that we build cadres of people who are moving forward. You know, there's been a lot of discussion about, oh, climate change didn't get much attention in the elections, you know, or our leaders, our political elected leaders lack ambition around doing something for climate change, as the UN would phrase it. But I learned working in the US Senate that, you know, elected officials basically rarely um, start a parade. They usually look for a parade and they run around to the front to be recognized as part of it. So if we're not seeing what's desperately needed to be done happening for a healthy climate future, best thing for us to do is to be boosting awareness, action, and advocacy for that to happen. And it can occur in lots of different ways. Talk to you a little bit about the boosting awareness. On the action front, you know, there's a climate action conversation that you can do in about 20 minutes that I have outlined in the book. And I actually have a transcript of a live, unrehearsed discussion so that you could see how it unfolds and how anybody can be talking with somebody else about what's involved. So we have the example of Seth. So I asked Seth, well, what are your hopes for a healthy climate? And he said, well, I really want there to be a way that, you know, he and his family and friends and generations to come will have this healthier future. And so that's where his motivation is coming from. Well, what do you love to do? He said, well, I really love being outside. I love doing things in the community, and I like gardening. Well, you know, okay, if you look at the AAA, awareness, action, or advocacy, which appeals to you? He said, well, I'm a person of action. Okay, well, what actions do you think you could do to marry up, you know, what you love to do with what's needed? He said, well, you know, I could create and work with my neighbors to have a neighborhood garden. We could demonstrate these best practices for regenerative agriculture, as it's called, agriculture that holds the carbon in the soil, gets it out of the atmosphere. And it would be great. We'd build a neighborhood, we'd build awareness, we'd build support, and understanding of how important climate change is and how important and how significant our actions and the actions of others can be. So that's like gets a whole flywheel rolling about how to make a difference in these contexts. And you know, something as I talked with them, it wasn't like this doom and gloom about, oh, climate change, you know, we're going to go to hell in a handbasket. It was like, oh, this could be fun. You know, I could enjoy doing this. And that's what we
That is
need. That's the energy that's going to keep this rolling.
That is excellent. That's the essence of your book. And I, we can't do the whole book in the conversation, but another thing that really crossed my mind regarding your book was the fact that, we are big consumers. We're a consuming world, and the United States is consuming so much more than other nations. And you quote Lynn Quist in your book, who's written a book about the soul of money and about sufficiency. She talks about sufficiency. Now, are you asking people to cut back on their spending, or did you include that conversation for a different reason?
Well, you bring up a really critical issue, which is, and it's a core issue of what gives us true happiness. You know, is it all the things? I remember during the dot-com boom in Silicon Valley, they had license plates that read, he who has the most toys wins.
Mhm.
You know, in essence, sort of a consumerist view of the world. And, you know, as we grasp for all these material things to try to make ourselves feel better, really is the result that we feel better. Because that comes from a sense of scarcity, a fear about there not being enough, and I can never get enough. There can never be enough. Um, and we need to shift to this sense of that there is an inherent abundance of positive human spirit if we choose to tap it, an abundance of resources if we choose to access them and share them in reasonable ways. And I love Lynn Quist's comment that, sufficiency is the new abundance. So many people and friends of ours are deacquisitioning, as they call it. That is kind of trying to let go of the things that they have and actually making them available to other people. There are now online ways to give up the extra stuff that people have so it can be used by other people rather than going to the dump. You know, we have a terrible consumer culture. Just fast fashion is an example. There's 100 billion pieces of new fashion produced each year. And the analysis that's been done is that within 12 months, 50 billion of those pieces will be in landfill. And there's a huge, many fabrics are actually made, rayon and other things are actually made from forests. And there's a huge drain that happens with this fast fashion. So it's really kind of a way of saying, well, what's really important here? Is it, and some people are out, and some influencers, if you will, are highlighting, how they're dressing themselves with things that they got, from thrift stores or used sources. So I think we really have to look at it in a different way, because you'll see in the book, as you did, that if everyone in the world were to have the average North American's lifestyle, and many of us are much above the average North American's lifestyle, but if everyone were to have the average North American lifestyle, we need 4.7 planets worth of resources for everybody to have that. So let's think about that. Right now we've created a culture and we've exported that culture to have everybody want to have what we have. But we have an equation that doesn't solve here. And with climate change resulting in droughts or floods or extreme weather events making people's livelihoods less stable, we're going to have all kinds of problems having, first of all, a fundamentally unsustainable way of life, compounded by climate change that adds disruption and chaos. So we're creating a perfect storm for a very turbulent world unless we choose to make different choices. And so as the most advanced industrial country in the world, we actually have the largest responsibility because, as I mentioned, that 1.5 trillion tons of excess CO2 entered in the atmosphere. The United States alone is responsible for a third of that. Now, some people say, well, what about China? Well, China has half of that legacy amount of greenhouse gases that they've contributed. So we're going to have to come up with a way through how we view our consumption, how we share technologies and do other things to find a way to have this global equation solved, or we're in for ever increasing and ever more frustrating challenges and competitions and other things that can't solve because they're fundamentally unsolvable in the way we're pursuing them.
That's a lot to think about, but it's something new to grapple with, and the people we're not going to name names, but there are people at the helm of our world who are living extravagant lives. I mean, we're worshiping billionaires right now, it seems. How do we shift that paradigm? I don't expect you to answer this. I'm thinking out loud that we shouldn't move away from what makes us the United States, but at the same time, I can see value in what you're saying. We're setting up an equation in the world that won't work.
But one thing is clear: we are at a crossroads. The choices we make today will determine the fate of our planet and the generations that follow. Ignoring the problem will only lead to more suffering and displacement. We must act, and we must act now. The time for complacency is over. The time for bold, decisive action is here.